who know the country, and I've been going there for almost for 3 decades, it is unbelievable and rather and terribly sad. In the last year, we saw hopes with the granting of Georgia of EU accession. Who know the country, and I've been going there, status. Then we saw the passing of this foreign influence, foreign agent law, mass demonstrations last spring. Then we saw a election last October in which Georgian Dream was called the victor by the Central Election Commission, but most people allege high levels of fraud. And then almost the final straw was the new government suddenly suspending in November. Suddenly. But unannounced suspension of EU accession, which had been part of their election programme in November, which sparked even bigger demonstrations, which continue to this day. Madam President, you were caught in the middle of this. Your term was due to expire in December, but you said that the new president that Georgian Dream was nominating was illegitimate, formed by an illegitimate parliament. So let's begin with that. What is your status at the moment? Where are you? You're a president, but you're a president without a presidential palace. Just tell us who you are, where you are. It's a difficult situation. We salute your bravery.
I don't think that the palace determines legitimacy. Legitimacy, as we know in democracy, and we had a kind of lecture on democracy this morning, which leaves me a bit in doubt of. But I think that the true democracy really comes from the people, and from the people, the legitimacy of the elections were rejected, and then the non-legitimate parliament, where there is no political party represented, started to take steps that were all unconstitutional. So there is also the problem of violating repeatedly the Constitution, and especially, I won't go into the detail, but the main part of this violation of the Constitution was its decision to suspend what is a part of the Constitution. It's Article 78, which asks every institution in Georgia to do the utmost to push the integration to European Union, Euro-Atlantic integration. That's a duty of every institution. Well, by then, there is no independent institution. There is no legitimate parliament. There was a parody of election of a president. So all of that is rejected, not by me, by the population that is on the streets, and on the streets now for the 78th day. Despite the repressions, despite the everyday arrests, fines, which are increasing, and for a country like Georgia, it's very difficult for people to be paying the equivalent of $2,000 because they are on the street, and somewhere somebody says that you have really been infringing the
obstructing the traffic or something.
So that's the situation. But I think that what is more important, if we look at Georgia, is really that these elections were elections that were stolen, but it's not an internal political issue. It's an issue of whether Russia can get over and recover a country that was for 30 years going towards Europe, towards the Euro-Atlantic integration, with support of the population of 80% or more. And it has even grown in the recent times. So Russia tries to take it over, and to take this country over in a much easier way than the war that it was unable to win in Ukraine, because Russia has not won the war in Ukraine. I don't know what will come out of the possible negotiations that are starting, but the fact is that for 3 years, Russia has not seen any of its objectives fulfilled in Ukraine. It has cost a lot to Russia in human resources, even if it doesn't count for Russia, but still the numbers are there. the economic cost, and the prestige cost, not to have been able to do what they had said they would do for the Russian military, for the Russian military elite, and so on. So the alternative strategy, the hybrid strategy, is why not win Georgia through proxy, through a man that is today controlling Georgia without having any political status. Let's talk about legitimacy. Not elected, and the one-party system that is very much looking more and more like a Russian one-party system, and through elections with many different forms that were tested, call centers, the use of the personal, how is it called, on the personal indications of the lists of for the citizens, and regular, more traditional ways of stealing the elections. And that way you get this government, this proxy government, to be put into power and take the decision that you were expecting for, and especially after the candidate status that you wanted to be taken, which is to take Georgia away from its European path back to the Russian path. And that's very dangerous, because if that works in Georgia, and I don't see sufficient reactions from our European partners or American partners for the time being, then that might be tested somewhere else.
Right.
And Georgia is not only Georgia, and it's not only this country that with 80% of the population and much longer before that was supportive of the European path. It is the Black Sea. It is who is going to control tomorrow the Black Sea. And before this recent period and before the Ukrainian war, we had port calls by NATO vessels and by all the European partners. This has stopped. Russia has announced that it is opening a new military naval base in the occupied territory of Georgia, in Abkhazia. The port of Anaklia, that is one of the big projects, nobody knows whether the Chinese are taking it over. That's what we hear. But of course, like it's always the case with the Chinese, you don't see the contract, you don't know the content of the contract, and we'll hear about it once it's finalized. And even then, you don't read it. And that means that this region that was a very important region for the future projects of the European Union, of connectivity, of energy, of opening the way towards Central Asia that itself is interested of moving certainly more discreetly, but moving a little bit away from the Russian dominance or from the Chinese dominance. All of that is at stake. So I think it's much more than Georgian politics. It's much more than one party winning over an opposition. It is a challenge for the European Union.
For sure. We'll definitely get back to the geopolitics, but I want to ask you about the domestic situation in Georgia. There's deadlock at the moment. The Georgian Dream has clung on to power. It's refusing to hold new elections. Opposition parties are out of the parliament. They're boycotting the parliament. The momentum seems to be on the streets, ordinary citizens going out, mobilizing themselves, protesting. But as you say, at great cost. A friend of mine just got this 5,000 lari fine, a huge number, a famous journalist now on hunger strike. But it seems to be deadlocked. So what is the strategy? We can talk about what the European Union is or isn't doing, or the United States, but what is the strategy within Georgia? And do you see yourself part of that political strategy to work with political parties in Georgia?
Yeah, certainly. I've been working with political parties before the elections. We have a common European charter that is the action plan for what has to be done, what had to be done after the elections at that time, but it remains very much current, this action plan, because it's really doing the priorities that were the priorities that should have been realized by the Georgian Dream government if they had delivered on the recommendations of the European Union after getting the candidate status. It's also part of this action plan to revoke all the Russian laws, because the Russian laws, it's not just one Russian law that was twice introduced, and that is directed at the civil society, at the non-governmental organizations. It's a copy of what has happened in Russia to take control over the civil society. But there have been many more laws of repression of different type. There is a law that is now in preparation to stop financing for the media, which are in a very difficult situation today, the critical media, especially the media in the regions, which are represented by this women journalist that is today on their 29th day, I think, of hunger strike. More than that, I think. That is very concerning. There is a Russian law on the offshore, which makes Georgia, and that should be a matter of concern for all the partners, it makes Georgia an offshore of the offshores. And what does it mean? It means that not only Mr. Ivanishvili as the top oligarch of Georgia, but also the potential sanctioned oligarchs, Russian oligarchs, could bring over their assets to Georgia.
So the situation is terrible. I think we can agree on that. The question is, how do you resist? How do you stop it?
We resist.
You resist, but obviously it's difficult to mobilize people. They're tired. Some of them have been out on the streets for months. They're hit with
Nobody
heavy fines.
is mobilizing the people.
No, they're mobilizing themselves. But
they're mobilizing themselves.
But it's obviously, unfortunately, it's not enough to deliver change at the moment. So.
Well, nobody thinks it's not a revolution. I think that everybody, and you have a very conscious population that is very peaceful and very conscious of the fact that we are in a geopolitical situation that does not allow for a revolutionary path. So your question is, how do you defeat a dictatorship? Because by now we have a weak but a dictatorship. By resisting. And I think that's the determination of the people. I think that my role is to try to consolidate even more the existing political parties, but not only the existing ones, because clearly the street protest is in the process of creating new political forces, which are going themselves to define probably the next strategy of the street. And what is very important, and that's why the regime cannot do anything about it, it's that there is no one single organizer. They would love to see these street protests being organized by one or two parties and say, well, that's their responsibility. We're going to put them in jail and that's finished. That's not the case. It's very dispersed. It's very multi-headed. It's very unpredictable, sometimes very creative. And what I hear, and I'm not an organizer of the protests either, I'm a supporter. What I hear from those people is that they are determined to stay on the streets, to stay for some of them in jail if that needs to. And nobody has invented what is a strategy to defeat a dictatorship, but resisting. Of course, the outside support is important. Morally, it's important for the population, and that's usually what they ask me to convey, is they want to be seen, they want to be heard, they want the truth to be said. One thing that is always received very critically is when some of our partners think that there is still something to do to stop Georgian Dream of going all the way towards Russia and away from Europe. when we all know inside the country that it's finished. That game has been lost. So what people are expecting is the truth to be said, the condemnations to be clear. The rest is for us to do. Nobody is expecting any form of direct intervention, direct support. But some of the things that have been said, like when the European Union, especially the institutions, say that whatever was delivered to the government in terms of governmental programs financing should be transferred to the civil society. All the different groups I've seen before coming here, especially for that, everybody told me we have not seen anything. And by the time it arrives, it might be too late.
So you used the phrase insufficient reaction earlier from the European Union. Obviously, there's a Hungary issue, as we know, that immediately after the election, the Hungarian Prime Minister flew to Tbilisi to congratulate Georgian Dream, and so Hungary would block some of the more punitive measures. But what could the European Union do more, and what could individual member states do more?
They could do what Hungary has done. If Hungary could go and recognize the next day, the other governments, after weeks and weeks in which they have not recognized, could say that these elections were not free, were not fair, and that this government is illegitimate. The country can be done also, individually, of course, if that's not a consensus position. And again, see what they can do for the civil society that is doing this resistance by itself, and what can be done is certainly to support the media, to support the media in the regions, to support what is in the process of being created by themselves. Again, it's very, which are trade unions, local trade unions. Right. All of that is civil society and can be supported, can be...
But you seem to be saying it's already too late, that the repression now has...
No, I'm not. I didn't say that.
Well, you said the repression has increased.
For the European Union, by the time this bureaucracy gets their act together, but it won't be too late for us, because I think that the population is ready to go to the end. And one should not ignore the fact that there is weakness on the side of the regime also, because a regime that is isolated from its own population, that is not governing the country. There has not been one positive decision taken since the elections. Sure. The only decisions that are been taken every day, day after day, are repressive measures. That's a repressive apparatus, and that's a regime that is just fueling this repressive apparatus. It's not governing the country. And so what happens? We are in a very interesting case.
Very interesting case. I mean, I also want to sort of challenge you a little in the sense that I think Georgia is a very interesting case. There's no diplomatic relations with Russia. The only formal institutional links are still with Europe. All the links with Russia are indirect. And as you mentioned, there's outreach to China, free trade agreement with China, close links with Azerbaijan, with Hungary. So it seems they're playing, many people would say this is not a proxy. This is a regime which has a business arrangement with Russia, but it wants to be non-aligned. Maybe the model is Azerbaijan, something who is a non-aligned. You reject the West, but you also try to have multiple partnerships with Russia, China, Hungary, other places. So it's a curious case of a regime, this one.
It's not a curious case because it's a copycat of a Russian model. It's much more than even Azerbaijan or other countries. And it's very easy. You just have to listen to the reactions of the Russian leadership to each and every decision of this proxy government, with which they have much more. You say there are no direct links. But they are much
well, everything goes on behind the scenes.
Well, that doesn't mean that there are not direct links. Sometimes they're much stronger than formal links. We have more air links with Russian different cities than we have with European cities. And the trade with Russia, which was declining, and the European Union had become the first partner, Turkey was the one country first partner, all of that is reversed in favor of Russia. And we are now officially in a circumvention of sanction for some products that have been very clearly identified, which serve directly the Russian regime. So it's much more than neutrality.
But if the government was to stop pretending and to openly restore diplomatic relations with Russia, do you I mean, we're talking about a country which, as you said, for 3 decades has been very pro-European. Do you think there are people in the institutions, in the ministries, who are sort of sitting on the fence? They haven't resigned, they're a bit passive. Do you think could be a trigger in which this regime if it moves more openly towards Russia, it begins to crumble?
Well, that's how the decision of the 27th of November has been taken by the population, that it's clearly the decision which was brewing for 2 years. The insults towards Europeans, the insults towards Americans, the propaganda, the Russian propaganda type, all of that was brewing. And that has been understood, and that's why this massive, that people do not need to see more, they do not need to see the opening of the embassy in Moscow, or they do not need to see what might happen, which is the de facto president going on the 9th of May to Moscow, which might happen. That will certainly even more increase but that's already the feeling and the reason why there is such a resistance. Because Georgian population has been going out on the streets massively for decades, not only these past 30 years. Each time when the independence was at stake, each time when the main orientation was at stake. And one thing should be clear, that the 80% in favor of the European pass by the Georgian population over these 33 years, almost, maybe in the first years there was no opinion polls, is not because people understand exactly what European Union is about or the European programs. It is because there is this inner sense that is our only alternative but to go back to Russia. So that is an existential battle, and that is why it's going to be fought to the end, whatever the end is. That is why I stay in the country. Everybody's asking me, aren't you out? No, I'm in.
But one more question for me before I turn it over to our audience. Surely a grim reality of the last week of a direct phone call between President Trump and Putin, possible negotiations. This makes life much harder for you, yes?
Yes and no. Again, we are two faces of the same coin. Whatever happens to Ukraine determines, of course, much of our future, but it does determine your future too. Sometimes Europeans do not see it that clearly. And what will happen to Georgia also determines your future. It determines certainly the future of Armenia and of its European past. It determines the future of the Black Sea, the future of all the major infrastructural projects that the European Union had, and that most of those were going through the Black Sea. It might determine the future of many elections in European countries, because if Russia gets the idea that this works well, it's not costly, you don't get sanctions when you behave that way towards a small country, you don't have military costs and others, then Russia might be tempted to use it elsewhere. And I regret very much what was said today by the Vice President of the United States about Romania, because that could be like a green light given to Russia to test again another country with elections, because that's a hybrid way that is much easier for a country that is led by a KGB agent. He knows that much better than he knows military operations.
Thank you so much, Madam President. Now let's get some questions from our audience. Is there a microphone? Please introduce yourself.
My name is Gabriela von Habsburg. I wanted to ask you, why don't you press more for personal sanctions in Georgia? I think that would be something that would really work.
It does.
Thank you.
For a long time, as a president, I was very reluctant to myself talk about sanctions, because it's always, when you have sanctions in the country, you have sanctions against the country also. It's not only individually. I know, but it's taken outside as a country that has sanctioned people. So, but it's very true. These sanctions have been requested by the population. People are asking, and now before coming here, I have 3 different appeals from the prisoners and their lawyers, from the media people, to requests for individual sanctions. Unfortunately, the European sanctions on diplomatic passports are a bit, very little, because everybody has a second passport. So much more important are 2 things. One, individually, even if it's not done collectively by the European Union, even if it's individual countries, and the intermediary people, not only the top responsible people, that's very important, they are very identified, but also the people in between that are executing. And that is very true, for instance, in these latest repressions, the policemen that come and do false testimonies. And they are identified because they have to give their names. And those people, even if a few of them were sanctioned, it would give a strong signal that you cannot, in impunity, do whatever you want. So yes to sanctions. And that is a very strong revendication today of the people.
Thank you. Who else? Please introduce yourself.
Lisa Heinrich, I'm with the Wellcome Trust. So one question I had, so my family's Georgian, and it's terrible to see what happened, because that society, just like what happened over the last 30 years, was just like really just like progress, and now just like seeing that crumble is terrible. But what I was wondering is, let's play that, play the games, like let's say the protesters were successful, the government would be forced to step down. Russia has troops in South Ossetia, right, and Abkhazia. Are you worried that Russia would then make a military move? And what are your reflections on that? Like, what happens the day after?
First, I would say, before the tragic part, I would say that there is a very optimistic part, which is that during these protests, we have seen the emergence of a real civil society that is self-organized, that is responsible, that is peaceful, that is political. And that's very impressive, even for... We are all surprised by what has happened. So that's the optimist part for the future, because that doesn't disappear. For Russia, you can never know, and you can never say. And what I will say, that the only way in which any of the countries that are around Russia and further down in Europe can be sure that Russia will not intervene any longer is the day when peace negotiations will include all the occupied territories by Russia. Unless Russia recognizes definitely its own territory, its own borders, we will all be always under the risk that Russia again decides to intervene here or there, either in a hybrid way, as in Georgia, or in a military way, as in Ukraine. So Russia back into its own territory is the way out. For the other things, you can always be afraid, but that doesn't change the future.
What is your? There are certainly some Georgians, I've met them, who are afraid. You know, they don't like Georgian Dream. They want to join Europe, but they're afraid of Russia. They're afraid of instability. And we know Georgian Dream obviously didn't get the large numbers that it claimed in the election, but it did get some votes. And
yes, but
and that's the category of people. What's your message if you meet those voters? What do you say to those people?
First of all, that the only country that has ever started a war has been Russia, whereas the Georgian Dream propaganda was that it were the Europeans and the Americans that wanted to open the second front.
Yeah.
That's one thing. The second thing is that for some reason, before the Georgian Dream and Russian propaganda, which is one, using Russian propagandists to, before that, 80 and more % of the Georgians were supportive of the Euro-Atlantic path and were not afraid. Russia was the same. So that fear is real when you use it in a very intensive way, and that was very Russian-fueled and very well-organized propaganda. It works to a certain extent, but also, and that was very interesting, it served for people to explain why they would be, when they had other vested interest, why they were supporting a pro-Russian Georgian Dream. So people would tell you, no, I'm not pro-Russian, I just don't want war.
Yeah.
So it's a very good explanation for something that they inside. I would go to the extreme of saying that I don't think, including in the Georgian Dream supporters, I don't think that there is more than 3% or 5% that would not mind going back to the Russian-dominated Georgia. That's so much against the... But they have other reasons. They have ties, they have interest, they have sometimes compromise, and they have this, which they give to themselves as an explanation of why they can continue supporting regimes that maybe serves them in other ways, big contracts.
But to win an election, you also need to talk to those people. You need to communicate with them. Those are the people you need if you are to succeed.
Yes.
Yeah.
But you need to have free and fair elections.
Indeed. Okay, and then over here, yeah. Okay. Please introduce yourself.
Fia Markus Heller, Cemizzoli Katulia. So my question is about the role of the academia in Georgia in this current situation. Well, the academia is generally a very international network, and most certainly very well linked to Europe and, of course, the United States and so on. But what is the development of the academia right now in the country? And I am also interested in the particular role of the university in Kutaisi, which is founded by the party leader.
Yeah. Well, the universities are not functioning like nothing in the country. Everything is stopped. I mean, that's another thing, that everything is more or less paralyzed and stopped. And there is a big concern about the fact that some of the programs, Erasmus and other things, might be affected in the near future, which for the Georgian students and professors and things was an integral part of their development, and the real opening on Europe came from that. It was extremely used by the Georgians. So I've no doubt about the fact that those people are the main supporters of the protest movement. For the Kutaisi University, it's very strange. Because I probably was one of the strongest supporter of the Kutaisi University when it was opened, and I was saying everywhere in my speeches at that time, I was to say that there was no other country in the world that during the COVID epidemic had opened a $1 billion university in a region. But nothing has been done to really sustain this university, to have it opened on the outside world. And it's existing, but it has not played the role that was supposed to play. So my conclusion today would be that more than really having a second university in the region that would be opened on the outside world, it was the idea of maybe having some money invested and maybe cleaning or blanchir some.
Thank you. At the back, yeah.
Thank you very much. Frédéric Petit. I am a French member of parliament elected by diaspora in Germany, Central Europe and the Balkan. I have a question about the mobilization of the youth, because in my constituency there is also a kind of thing like that in Serbia today. And my question would be very clear. Are you preparing, can we prepare with you, as kind of help, the territorial elections? There will be municipal elections. And when I discuss with the youth of Georgia, I feel this energy that you mentioned, but when I'm talking about people living in villages, will you go to the election, to the next election?
You're talking about the local elections?
Yes, local election. There will be a local election at the end of this year.
Yeah.
Could it be in a midterm or long-term strategy to make democracy come back?
I don't think so. I don't think that in today's context, unless we have parliamentary elections before, or at the extreme maybe together with the local elections, I don't think people will go to local elections because they will not believe that this can be held under. That means local elections mean that it will be completely under the control of the one party, because nothing would have changed at the governing level. And the one party is already preparing local elections. They are every day changing the electoral code even more to adapt it to their own needs. So there will be, even if parties would go to those elections, there would be such a distrust in the population about how can it be that those elections suddenly become free and fair when parliamentary elections have not been, that it's very difficult to imagine. But that's something that will have to be decided by the political parties in time. For today, the protest movement is completely oriented towards the one demand, which is new elections.
More questions? Sorry, yes, Gwen, I can see you. I'm a bit blinded.
Gwen Sasse from the Center for East European and International Studies in Berlin, SOIS. Thank you very much for your remarks. Looking from the outside at what's happening in Georgia, I think what's remarkable is that sort of a new format of protest is being created, and sort of these waves of protests and protests, at least that's what it looks like, also integrated into everyday life, certain times, certain places, and sort of a much greater flexibility in response, I think, to repression. So my question is how sustainable this mode is, and what you think the effect is on society. I mean, is that kind of protest bringing more and more people, maybe not necessarily out into the street, but basically to support what this is about? Or is there also a moment when, or to what extent is there maybe also an increase in a certain polarization in society, because not necessarily because one thinks Georgian dream is great, but maybe other social, economic issues also, the wish for stability increases as well. So I find that very hard to judge from the outside if it's actually creating more unity, or if all kinds of other and also understandable issues or divides might actually increase or are already increasing.
There are not really any other issues because, as I said, the country is at a standstill. So it's difficult to know what it does to the society at large because there is no real way to measure that. What I would say that the sense that people have from the protest is that It has increased their own energy because they have discovered that they are part of society that they now see they can connect to. There is and there has been polarization, and it's certainly served by the authorities that are trying to use every occasion to increase this polarization. And one of their scenario is to push to something that would be a civil confrontation. They have been talking about, they have been having small clips about it, so that it's something that they have in their mind, because that has happened in the 90s in Georgia, so it's something that people fear. But there is no sign of it on the streets. There is really, on the one side, the civil society, and on the other side, the police forces. There is nobody else. And fortunately, there is nobody else.
Thank you.
Ekat Qashilashvili, former Foreign Minister of Georgia. And I guess I'll take the liberty to comment a little bit rather than ask you a question, Madam President.
Please.
I mean, listening to the discussion, I guess, to a few points to add, perhaps, to what has been said already. One, if we sort of address the audience now here in the room, just to strengthen perhaps the argument, how much Georgia has been for a long time testing ground for Russia to unfold the playbook that Russia played out in a larger scale than in some other countries as well. So Georgia was the first country in 2008 that was attacked by Russia, and then remained to be under Russian partial occupation ever since, with the creeping annexation of some parts of the territories even after. We've seen that response that was extremely weak at the time to Russian occupation and aggression prior to that paved the way when it comes to Russia's planning and aggressiveness towards Ukraine in 2014, and then what happened in Ukraine in 2014 paved the way to what happened in Ukraine in 2020. So while we might be seeing some of it, what is happening in isolation, like speaking today about, you know, in your perception perhaps that what happens in Georgia is the Georgian internal process of fighting for democracy, all along, it has been part of a bigger playbook for Russia. And unlike to the West, unfortunately, Russia never gets fatigued. So you can never have Russia fatigued with what happens in Georgia or with what happens with Ukraine, with what happens in other countries. They can play in parallel playfield, so to say. In Europe, unfortunately, we frequently heard as Georgians like, oh, Europe is very fatigued right now by Georgia and integration and all of that. So in that regard, my main message here is that when it comes to Georgia, already what happens in Georgia now is not a small movement. It's not just students. It's all over the society in different major cities and beyond that is integrated into that. And it's not going to fade. There will be no acceptance to illegitimacy of this government. So you like it or not, there will be no stability in Georgia until the legitimacy comes back. So that's one. Second, so, I need to finish. Well, I guess there are not that many Georgians that can speak here.
But sure, but we're actually here to... Thank you so much.
No,
but we've got 2 minutes and we need to listen to the President again. So I do accept my apology. So back to you.
Very unfortunate that we cannot add actually something very important that I wanted to add. Madam President, if it's okay with you, just one important element. And Thomas, I would appreciate if you would give more space to Georgians to speak up at this event. Now, when it comes to America, for Europe, I think Georgia is a good ground for common ground now. There is very strong bipartisan support. You've seen that, Madam President, in Washington as well for Georgia. Very active process in Senate and Congress. Europe can unite with America on this issue, which will not be controversial in that regard. And with united effort, there can be more action that could be delivered. So that could be a good opportunity for positive, proactive action with EU and between EU and NATO. And I guess that's the good moment for you to utilize that, because America will be with EU on this regard.
Thank you. Do you some thoughts about the United States from you? Maybe in conclusion, because our time. You also met Mr. Trump at Notre Dame at the end of last year.
Yes,
I don't know how long you had with him.
And I was at the inauguration in January. And my message to the initial contacts, because these were not working contacts at all, but so very short message that I had. And my message was to Mr. Rubio and to others that Georgia could be a solution for the United States of a crisis, or it could become a problem. Mm-hmm. And it's their choice.
Right.
and it's true also of the European Union, but it's truer for a new administration that has they have one problem with Ukraine, a very big one. We are a smaller problem, but not that small because it has consequences. And it's very easy to find a solution if, I agree with that, if the United States and the European Union get together. I don't think that the small Georgia cannot be solved and become a good solution and an example of a democratic solution.
Thank you so much, Madam President. I think the message we're getting loud and clear is don't forget Georgia. I certainly don't, but I hope this is a message that goes out more widely. Thank you for your courage, for your continued fight, and it's very good to talk to you. So join me in thanking President Salome.
Thank you.
This is a message that goes out more widely. Thank you for your courage, for your